The sun was low in the Texas sky, casting long shadows across the rolling hills that surrounded the Matthews family farm. The land was peaceful, too peaceful, some would say. But to John Matthews, it was everything. After years of service as a Delta Force commander, John had found solace in the quiet rhythms of farm life. The hard work, the sunburned hands, and the calm evenings spent on the porch with his dog, Max, had become the closest thing to peace he had known in decades. But peace, as he had learned the hard way, was often a temporary illusion. John wiped the sweat from his brow as he leaned on the worn shovel, looking out over the rows of crops. The air smelled like fresh earth, and the only sound was the occasional chirp of a cicada. In the distance, the small, aging farmhouse he called home stood against the vast backdrop of the open plains. The old red barn was still holding together despite years of neglect, just like John himself. Life on the farm wasn't glamorous, but it was good. It was all he had left after the military. No more missions, no more bloodshed. Just him, Max, and the land. As the sky darkened and the crickets began their evening chorus, John felt a strange prickle on the back of his neck. He wasn't sure if it was just the quiet getting to him, or something else. That's when he heard it. A distant engine, low and growling, breaking the silence. The sound of tires crunching over gravel reached his ears, growing steadily louder. A vehicle. Not just any vehicle, but the unmistakable roar of a heavy-duty truck or SUV, something meant to navigate rough terrain. John's eyes narrowed. This was no casual visitor. He straightened up, his military instincts kicking in, even though he had sworn never to use them again. He scanned the horizon, his eyes darting back and forth as the sound of the approaching vehicle became clearer. Max, lying by the porch, suddenly perked up, his ears alert. The dog was usually as laid back as John, but even he could sense something wasn't right. The truck came into view, a blackened, bullet-riddled SUV that kicked up dust as it barreled down the dirt road toward the farm. John's hand instinctively went to the back of his jeans, where the grip of a Glock was hidden, but he didn't draw it. Not yet. The truck slowed as it neared the gate. John's heart began to race, and he moved toward the front of the house, staying out of sight. His breath was steady, his mind running through the possibilities. Who would be coming here? It wasn't until the truck stopped that John saw the first person step out. A tall figure dressed in tactical gear, face obscured by a mask, holding an automatic rifle. More men followed, all armed, all wearing similar gear. John's pulse quickened, and his thoughts raced. Cartel? Military? The men didn't appear to be local. Their movements were too deliberate, their equipment too advanced for small-time crooks. Something felt wrong. Max barked from the porch, his stance alert. John's eyes flicked to the dog. Max was no ordinary farm dog. He had been trained to protect, to guard. But John had always kept him on a leash, figuratively speaking. Tonight, though, Max had a job to do. The men began to move in, slowly, cautiously, making their way toward the front door. Who are they? What do they want? John whispered to himself. His mind flashed back to his time in the field. Years of stealth, reconnaissance, and understanding the enemy before they understood him. This was no random raid. This was planned. John's hand tightened on the Glock, and for a moment, he considered calling Emma, his neighbor, to warn her. But as soon as the thought crossed his mind, the sound of metal scraping against metal shattered the silence. A loud bang echoed across the field. The door to his barn was kicked open, and men began to pour inside. John's heart raced. No, he muttered, barely above a whisper. He wasn't ready for this. Not today. Not like this. But he wasn't going to run either. They had made a mistake by coming here. Big mistake. John Matthews wasn't just a farmer anymore. He was a Delta Force commander, and they were about to find out just how deep that training went. He took a slow breath, focused, and slipped back behind the cover of the farmhouse. It was time to protect what he had left, and this time, there would be no retreat. The last time John Matthews had been this focused, it was on a mission in a foreign land, sweating in the desert, navigating through hostile territory, and strategizing his every move. The farm had been a quiet reprieve from the constant hum of military operations. But now, as the sound of boots crunching on dirt grew louder, The old instincts were sharpening once again, and John was pulled back into a life he had tried to forget. His grip on the Glock tightened, and for a moment, the years of training, of wars fought in places no one spoke about, came rushing back. But this wasn't a battlefield in the Middle East or South America. This was his farm, his sanctuary. And these men, whoever they were, had made the mistake of thinking they could take it from him. The men were moving toward the house now, and John crouched low, blending into the shadows. His mind raced as he scanned the surroundings, analyzing the situation with the precision of someone who had done this countless times before. There was no time for hesitation. John Matthews had been through hell and back, but it wasn't just the violence that haunted him. It was the memories of the men he had lost, his brothers in arms who had never made it back. He could still hear their voices, see their faces in the quiet moments when he thought he was safe. Kevin, James, Lucas, they were all gone now, and the weight of that loss had driven him to walk away from it all, to find peace in a place where the sounds of gunfire didn't haunt his dreams. But peace was a fragile thing, and it was never meant to last. John had joined the army at 18, driven by a sense of duty, a desire to make a difference in the world. His family had been proud, but they didn't truly understand. There were days when John could still feel the tightness in his chest from the pressure of being a soldier, the relentless missions, the secrecy, the never-ending need to prove himself. As a young man, he had been idealistic, eager to fight for the greater good. But after years in special operations, after missions that pushed him to the edge of human endurance, his view of the world had changed. The lines between right and wrong blurred in the chaos, and the cost of war began to wear on him. His time in Delta Force had been nothing short of grueling. The elite unit was made up of the best, trained for missions that no one else could handle. They were sent where the world's rules didn't apply, where failure wasn't an option. John had executed covert operations in war zones that never made headlines, killing targets and extracting assets, often in situations so dangerous that most would have run in the opposite direction. It was in the midst of these operations that he had forged the closest bonds of his life. But those bonds had been shattered in one fateful mission. The mission where Kevin, James, and Lucas had died. Their deaths were a turning point for John. He couldn't save them. They'd been hit by an ambush, trapped in the crossfire while he tried to lead them to safety. They died because of a mistake John had made, an error in judgment that he could never forget. That was the moment he decided he was done. He couldn't keep fighting. Not for his country. Not for anyone. The only person he could trust was himself, and the only place he could find peace was here, on this farm, far away from the bloodshed. He had sold his military medals, given away his uniforms, and buried his past beneath the soil of this land. But the past, as John was about to learn, had a way of finding you when you least expected it. The sound of movement outside snapped John back to the present. He glanced at Max, who was now alert, his tail stiff with tension. The dog knew it was time to act. John wasn't one to waste time. He moved swiftly, knowing every corner of the house like the back of his hand. He reached for his tactical vest, the one he hadn't worn in years, and strapped it on. It felt heavy, like a weight he'd been carrying all his life, but it was familiar. He loaded his pistol and slung a rifle over his shoulder. His heart was steady, focused on the task ahead. The men outside were getting closer. He had to act. Before he could move, the door to the barn swung open with a loud crash. His breath caught in his throat. He had to make his move now. John quickly set up a few quick traps around the perimeter of the house. Nothing fancy, just enough to slow them down. He had fought enough battles to know that the element of surprise was half the victory. He crept toward the back of the house, staying out of sight, and took his position by a small window. He watched as the men approached, their voices muffled, their movements deliberate. Whoever they were professionals. And that made John wonder, why had they targeted him? What had he done to deserve this? In the back of his mind, a terrible realization started to form. His former life as a Delta Force commander, all those covert operations, the enemies he'd made, they were all still out there. He might have walked away from it, but it hadn't walked away from him. The thought made his skin prickle. He couldn't afford to make mistakes now. John's pulse quickened as the men outside grew nearer. Their voices, still muffled but becoming clearer, were mixed with the sound of footsteps on gravel and the scraping of boots against the rough wooden porch. His fingers tightened around the stock of the rifle. The familiar weight of it felt like an old companion, one he'd longed to forget but now relied on more than ever. He glanced at Max, who sat alert, ears perked. The dog could sense the tension in the air, too. John had trained him well, but tonight would test both of them like never before. The first figure appeared in the distance, moving cautiously toward the house. A large, hulking man with a rifle slung over his shoulder. His eyes scanned the area as he approached the front door. John's eyes narrowed. The man was alone for now, but the rest of the group was close behind. He had only seconds to act. John ducked lower beneath the window, his movements deliberate and swift. He could hear the faint rustle of equipment from the men outside, and he knew they were preparing to breach the house. A full-scale assault. Stay calm. Analyze. Get them first. He thought back to his training, the lessons from his Delta Force days. The objective was simple. The men outside didn't know who they were dealing with. They thought they could just barge in, maybe intimidate him, maybe steal something. But John Matthews was no stranger to ambushes, to close-quarters combat. He had faced down enemies who had far more resources and far more firepower. And he always came out on top. He crouched low, slowly crawling to a small gap between the floorboards and the wall. There, in the shadows, he found what he needed. A small motion-sensing camera he had rigged weeks ago, just in case something like this happened. John had always been cautious, always prepared. The moment he saw the figures outside move, the camera had alerted him to their position. He could see them now, 5 men, dressed in tactical black, all armed with rifles. They were spread out, methodically sweeping the area. John could hear their muffled commands in Spanish, their words clipped and commanding. He didn't recognize the accents, but their professionalism told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't just some random robbery. The question nagged at him, what do they want? As the leader approached the front porch, John made his move. He slid silently to the back of the house, pausing for just a moment to check Max. The dog was still tense, his body low to the ground, waiting for a signal. John's mind raced through every possible scenario. He had only one chance to get this right. If he made even the smallest mistake, they would swarm the house. The noise, the confusion, it would all become a deadly game. Just then, a sudden crash from the barn made his heart skip a beat. It was louder than the others. The doors had been smashed open. John couldn't afford to hesitate now. He motioned to Max, stay close. Max followed obediently, his paws barely making a sound against the dirt floor as they moved toward the barn. John crouched low behind a stack of hay bales, scanning the area for the source of the noise. Through the crack of the barn door, he could see one of the cartel members entering, his silhouette cutting across the dim light. John's instincts flared. This wasn't just an intrusion. This was an all-out attack. They had come with a purpose. The barn wasn't just a random target. It was a key location, something the intruders needed, or at least thought they did. As the man entered the barn, John silently moved closer, staying in the shadows. The cartel member was focused, moving slowly through the dimly lit space, unaware that death was closing in. John adjusted his grip on his rifle, preparing to take the shot. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the front of the house. The sound of a door being kicked in. John's body tensed. They were in, and they had no idea who they were dealing with. He trained for moments like this. The years of hard-earned experience began to click into place. This was war. Max barked sharply, and the man in the barn froze. His head whipped around, and for a split second, John saw the look of surprise flash across the cartel member's face. That was all John needed. In a fluid motion, he stepped out from behind the hay bales, his rifle raised. The cartel member was still adjusting his position when John fired. The shot rang out, loud and clear in the silence of the barn. The bullet hit its mark, and the man crumpled to the floor. John quickly scanned the area, but before he could react, another figure appeared at the barn entrance. 2 more men. They had backup. It was time to go on the offensive. He moved quickly, flanking them from behind a stack of crates. The men inside the barn were still disoriented by the sudden assault. John didn't waste any time. The first man spun around, raising his rifle just as John moved in, already taking the shot. A clean hit. He was down before he had a chance to fire. The second man was quicker, but not quick enough. John tackled him to the ground, knocking the rifle from his hands. The man tried to fight back, but John was stronger, faster. A swift punch to the jaw stunned him, and John pulled the man into a chokehold, squeezing until the body went limp. John didn't have time to celebrate. He knew there were more outside. It wasn't over yet. His mind flashed back to the chaos of war, of being outnumbered and outgunned. Survival was everything. You couldn't hesitate, couldn't let your guard down. Every decision mattered. Every second counted. As he wiped the sweat from his forehead, John checked his rifle and made his way toward the door of the barn. He paused, listening to the sounds of movement outside. The front porch was still silent, too silent. The storm had only just begun. John crouched at the barn door, the weight of his rifle steady in his hands as he carefully surveyed the surroundings. The silence outside felt unnerving, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to break it. He could hear the faint rustling of the wind through the trees, the distant sound of Max barking from the porch, but no sign of the remaining attackers yet. The bodies of the men he had taken down in the barn were sprawled across the ground, their dark uniforms blending with the shadows. John knew it wouldn't be long before their comrades figured out what was happening. They would regroup, and they would come for him with even more ferocity. He made his way to the barn's far side, moving low to the ground, just as he had been trained in Delta Force. The years of rigorous training kicked in, instinctually guiding his every movement. Every step was calculated, deliberate. He had spent years in situations where seconds meant the difference between life and death, and tonight was no different. But these men were different. They weren't just random thugs looking to make a quick buck. They had a purpose, a plan. And as much as John hated to admit it, they had the upper hand, at least for now. He peered around the corner of the barn, scanning the surroundings for any signs of movement. The farmhouse loomed in the distance, quiet and seemingly untouched. But John knew better. They wouldn't just waltz into his barn and stop there. They would sweep the entire farm. The thought brought a flicker of unease to the pit of his stomach. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how carefully coordinated this attack had been. They had known exactly where to hit him. They weren't just targeting a random farm in the middle of nowhere. They were targeting John Matthews, the man who had once been Commander Matthews of Delta Force. That realization made his blood run cold. The very skills he had honed over years of dangerous operations had now become the very reason these men had come for him. He couldn't help but wonder, why? What had he done to attract the attention of a cartel? His time in the military had been nothing but a series of covert missions. Missions that no one would know about unless they had access to classified information. And yet, these men were here now on his land, as if they had somehow found him. John checked his phone quickly. No messages, no calls. His fingers hovered over the keypad, wondering if he should contact someone, maybe even the authorities. But he knew better. These men were no ordinary criminals. They wouldn't hesitate to take out anyone who got in their way. He had to handle this on his own, just like he had handled every other battle in his life. He silently moved back to the farmhouse, keeping to the shadows, trying to stay one step ahead of the approaching cartel members. He knew that if he could make it to the house undetected, he could use his old military training to set up a defense. As he reached the back door of the farmhouse, he heard a low hum in the distance, the sound of an engine revving, the sound of more vehicles, approaching fast. John's heart raced. Reinforcements. He cursed under his breath. The farm was about to become a war zone. Before he could take another step, his ears picked up the faintest sound, a rustling, like a whisper. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He wasn't alone. In a flash, he dropped to the ground, just as a shadow passed over the window. John's breath caught in his throat. The moment of calm had passed, and now it was a race against time. He knew exactly where the sound had come from. Someone had flanked him, moving silently in the tall grass near the barn. The strategy was simple. While John focused on the front, they were trying to sneak around to the back. They were good. John's mind raced as he quickly assessed the situation. The barn, the farmhouse, the perimeter, all vulnerable. His enemies were getting closer. Every second he wasted could be the moment that they found him. But he had one advantage. They didn't know who they were dealing with. With a smooth, practiced motion, John reached for the small, tactical knife strapped to his thigh and moved toward the back of the house. He knew it wasn't going to be easy. These men were trained, possibly ex-military, like himself, but they were not prepared for the kind of fight he was about to give them. As John crept around the corner of the house, he caught sight of one of the cartel members. His back to the wall, walking in his direction, completely unaware that death was waiting just a few feet away. John tensed, taking a deep breath to steady his nerves. One shot, one chance. The man was too close for a rifle shot. John had no choice. He had to move quickly. As the man passed by, John lunged forward, his body reacting with the same speed and precision that had kept him alive for years in the military. With a swift motion, he drove the knife into the man's side, just beneath the ribs. The cartel member gasped, his hand clutching at his side as blood began to pool beneath him. Before he could make a sound, John grabbed his collar and dragged him to the ground, muffling any noise. He was trained to kill quietly, efficiently, and he didn't hesitate. John didn't wait around to see if anyone heard the commotion. He pulled the knife free, wiped it on the man's shirt, and quickly moved back toward the barn. The group of cartel members still hadn't realized what had happened, but that wouldn't last long. They would soon know he was no longer the prey. He was the hunter. John's breath came in steady, controlled bursts as he moved through the shadows. The cool night air nipped at his skin, but his mind was sharp, focused on the task ahead. He had done this countless times before, but tonight felt different. The stakes were personal now. These men weren't just an enemy force to be neutralized. They were a threat to everything he'd worked so hard to protect. His farm, his freedom, his peace. The man he had taken down by the back of the house wasn't dead yet, but John didn't have time to dwell on him. The group of cartel members still had the upper hand in numbers. John had taken out 2, but there were still at least 3 more he had to deal with. And he didn't know how many reinforcements were on the way. The engine sounds he'd heard earlier were growing louder, which meant more trouble was just around the corner. He crouched low, moving swiftly toward the barn where he had previously engaged the other attackers. His boots made almost no sound as he navigated the terrain, using the cover of the tall grass and the shadows of the trees to stay hidden. The night had turned eerily quiet, and it almost felt as if the world was waiting for the next move, just as he was. How did they know? That question had been gnawing at him ever since the first signs of the attack. How had these cartel members found him? He had cut all ties with his past life. No one should have known he was here. No one except a few trusted allies, people who had long since moved on, just like he had. But he couldn't shake the feeling that these men weren't here by accident. They were looking for something, and John Matthews was their target. He reached the edge of the barn, crouching behind a large pile of hay bales. Peering out between the cracks, he saw the remaining members of the cartel moving cautiously around the farmhouse, still unaware of his exact position. Now or never. John silently moved to his right, keeping his body low and his mind alert. The sound of boots on gravel reached his ears as one of the men neared the barn, scanning the area with a flashlight. The beam cut through the night, briefly illuminating the edges of the barn and the surrounding field. John barely had time to react. He darted behind the barn, putting himself out of sight just as the flashlight flickered and moved away. The man's back was to him, and John's opportunity to strike was now. The familiar surge of adrenaline flooded his veins, and with it came the calm clarity of purpose that had been drilled into him during years of service in the military. As the man took another step forward, John emerged from behind the barn, moving like a shadow. He quickly closed the distance, silent but deadly. A swift strike to the back of the man's neck dropped him to the ground with a soft thud. The man didn't make a sound. His body simply crumpled, and John was already moving again, checking over his shoulder to make sure no one had heard. 3 down, but that wasn't enough. He couldn't let up. Where were the rest? He moved toward the farmhouse once more, keeping low and steady. The beam of the flashlight that had previously been sweeping the barn was now focused in the opposite direction. John used that moment to his advantage, darting across the open field and toward the edge of the porch, where 2 more men were talking in hushed tones. They had no idea. John knew that taking them both out quickly would be the only way to avoid being overwhelmed. He had to act fast. His plan was simple: separate and isolate. He took a deep breath, then moved toward the trees on the far side of the porch, using the thick foliage to obscure his movements. As he neared the first man, he paused, assessing the situation. The second man was further down, standing near the front door. The first man was his target. In one fluid motion, John pounced, tackling the man from behind, slamming him into the ground before he had time to react. The cartel member tried to scream, but John was quick, one hand covering his mouth, the other with a knife at his throat. The man's eyes widened with fear, but John didn't hesitate. He made the clean cut, silencing him forever. It was over before the man even had a chance to fight back. John stood, wiping the blood from his hands. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he didn't allow himself the luxury of taking a break. The second man hadn't moved from his position yet, and that meant John had one last chance to finish this before reinforcements arrived. He moved swiftly to the side, using the cover of the trees to get closer to the second man. He could hear the faint muttering of the cartel member as he continued to scan the area, oblivious to the danger behind him. The moment the man turned to look at something to his left, John lunged forward, grabbing the back of his head and slamming it into the wooden beam of the porch. The cartel member's body went limp instantly. The final threat neutralized. For a brief moment, John stood in the silence, his chest heaving as he surveyed the scene. He had just taken out 5 cartel members with minimal noise, minimal mess. But the job wasn't finished. John's mind was already racing. There were still more coming. Reinforcements. The engine noise was too close now, and he could hear more vehicles pulling up on the gravel driveway. He needed to move. He quickly checked the house. No sign of anyone inside. The farmhouse was still secure, but the fight wasn't over yet. The storm was only beginning. John moved to the barn and grabbed his tactical gear. He would need every advantage now. His pulse quickened as he glanced at the large gun safe in the corner, his fingers brushing against the cold steel. The weapons inside weren't just for show. They were part of a plan, a backup, just in case things went sideways. And they had. His instincts kicked in, and John began to set traps, just as he had done on countless operations before. Barbed wire, improvised explosives, and other distractions. The cartels wouldn't know what hit them, but the worst of it still loomed on the horizon. He wasn't sure who these men were or what they wanted with him. But one thing was clear: they had underestimated him. And John Matthews never underestimated his enemies. The stillness of the night was broken only by the distant hum of the truck's engines as John surveyed the wreckage of the cartel's attempted assault on his farm. The smell of smoke and gunpowder lingered in the air, sharp and acrid. He wiped his brow, his mind racing. He had just eliminated the immediate threat, but a gnawing feeling in the pit of his stomach told him that this was far from over. Why him? That question had been haunting him ever since the first gunshot rang out. The attack had been too precise, too well coordinated for it to be a random raid. The cartel had not only come for a farm, they had come for him. They had come for John Matthews, a former Delta Force commander, someone with years of military experience and a past that was supposed to be buried deep. But someone had found him. Someone had uncovered his hidden life. And now they were sending men to destroy it. His fingers trembled slightly as he tapped the phone screen. He wasn't sure who to contact. His old military contacts? The authorities? But then again, whoever was behind this would already be tracking his moves. His hand hesitated over the phone, then settled on one name: Chris Nolan, an old buddy from his Delta days. Chris had always been reliable, and John knew that if anyone could help him piece this together, it would be him. He wasn't just a former military man. Chris was an expert in intelligence gathering and counter-surveillance. If someone was behind this attack, Chris would know how to trace it. John quickly typed out a message. "I need your help. Urgently. The cartels are after me, but this goes deeper than just a random hit. They know who I am, and I need answers. Call me as soon as you get this. It's a matter of life or death." He hit send and waited. Minutes felt like hours. John's eyes darted over the barn, scanning for any signs of movement. The tension in his body was unbearable, his mind too full of questions to be calm. He paced back and forth, his thoughts constantly running through the last few hours, what he had seen, what he had done, and who exactly was behind it all. Finally, the phone buzzed. John grabbed it quickly, his heart racing as he saw Chris' name flash on the screen. John? What the hell's going on? Chris' voice was sharp and filled with concern. I don't know, Chris, John replied, his voice low. But this isn't just some random raid. They knew exactly who I was. These cartel guys, well, they were no amateurs. They came prepared. Who came for you? Chris asked, his voice now more serious. This isn't a joke, right? No, John answered firmly. I'm not kidding. They had intel. Somehow, they knew about my past. The only way they could have gotten that information is if someone is digging into my history. But I've cut ties with everyone. No one should know I'm here, not like this. Chris was silent for a moment, clearly thinking hard. Okay, first thing, where are you? Are you safe? I'm on my farm, but there's no such thing as safe right now, John said, glancing over his shoulder toward the barn and the bodies scattered across the field. I took out the initial group, but reinforcements were just arriving. I don't know how many more are coming. Chris sighed, the sound crackling over the line. Okay, we need to get you out of there. I'll gather some intel on the cartels, see if there's any chatter, any recent activity. But first, you need to get the hell out of there. The moment they realize what you've done, they'll be back with a bigger force. John looked out across the farm. The wind was picking up, but it wasn't enough to drown out the distant sound of another vehicle. His senses were on high alert. I can't just run, Chris. They'll follow me. If I leave now, I might be leading them straight to another target. John's voice was calm but firm. I need to know why they're coming after me. This isn't just about some random drug deal gone wrong. Chris was quiet for a long moment. All right, fine. You stay put for now. But listen to me. We'll work this out, John. You're not alone in this. I'll dig up everything I can, track every lead. You just need to keep your head down and keep moving. They might be hunting you, but you can use that to your advantage. Trust me. John nodded to himself. Chris was right. The hunt wasn't over, but neither was he. He had survived worse situations than this. Thanks, Chris. I'll keep you updated, John said. Stay sharp, Chris replied. I'll get back to you as soon as I have something. With that, the line went dead. John stared at the phone for a moment, then shoved it back into his pocket. He couldn't afford to waste time. Every second counted now. The vehicles were getting closer. John quickly moved toward the barn to grab his gear, the weight of the situation heavy on his shoulders. His mind was racing, but he couldn't let that stop him. He needed to think clearly. As he approached the barn, he spotted a familiar shape, his old truck, parked just behind the barn. It hadn't been touched, and the keys were still in the ignition. He had been ready to leave this place behind. But now, the idea of leaving didn't sit right with him. He was a soldier, and soldiers didn't run. The headlights of the approaching vehicles were now clearly visible, cutting through the darkness like a knife. John cursed under his breath and quickly jumped into his truck, firing up the engine. The roar of the engine felt like a defiant shout against the silence of the night. He had to make a decision, fast. He could either leave the farm and risk exposing himself to whoever was pulling the strings, or he could set another trap and stand his ground. John's hands gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. He wasn't about to let them chase him from his home. Not like this. He would face them, and when he did, he would make sure they regretted ever coming after him. John's grip on the steering wheel tightened as the headlights of the approaching vehicles grew closer. His pulse was steady, but his mind raced through calculations. He had moments, maybe less, before they realized they were walking right into another trap. There was no way he was going to let them get the drop on him again. He quickly turned the wheel, driving the truck toward the backside of the property, behind the barn where he had set the explosives earlier. He could hear the rumbling engines of the incoming vehicles behind him, but he didn't look back. His focus was razor-sharp. The wind whipped through the cracked windows as he drove, the air heavy with tension. The headlights of the trucks sliced through the darkness like jagged blades, revealing his every move. But John wasn't worried. He'd been in worse situations where he was outnumbered, outgunned, but still found a way out. He had something they didn't, experience. And in his case, Experience often meant the difference between life and death. He pulled the truck into position behind a cluster of trees, just far enough from the road so he could keep his enemies in sight, but hidden from view. The vehicles weren't far now. He could hear the tires crunching over the gravel, the low rumble of engines idling as the cartel men got out. John's eyes darted over the landscape. He still had time. He grabbed his gear, strapping on his tactical vest and slinging his rifle over his shoulder. Trap set. He made his way quietly toward a small, elevated position by the edge of the field. A small hill that would give him a good vantage point of the incoming trucks. From here, he could see everything. The men getting out, the way they moved. He could already tell they weren't as coordinated as the last group. They were more scattered, more cautious. They knew there was a threat, and they were wary of making the same mistakes the others had. John crouched low, keeping his silhouette to a minimum. His heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. His breath was steady, almost methodical as he checked his weapon. The first move would be his. He could see the men spread out, moving in small groups toward the barn. They were careful, but they were still overconfident. They hadn't learned from the mistakes of the last group. They thought they were still in control. That would be their undoing. He raised his rifle and waited. One man moved toward the barn doors, checking for any signs of life inside. Another scanned the perimeter, his back turned to John. The others were still moving cautiously toward the truck, unaware that the threat was closer than they realized. The seconds ticked by like hours. John's finger hovered over the trigger, each breath calculated, each moment weighing heavily on his shoulders. He wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting to protect everything he had left. His home, his life. The first man took another step forward. John squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out in the stillness of the night, sharp and precise. The man crumpled to the ground before he even had time to react. The rest of the men froze, their heads snapping in the direction of the shot. But it was too late. John had already moved. He dropped to the ground and rolled into the cover of a nearby thicket, his movements fluid and deliberate. He was out of sight before the men had a chance to return fire, and by the time they realized what had happened, he was already setting up his next shot. 2 down. The rest of the cartel members scrambled in panic, their movements erratic as they tried to locate the sniper. But they were scattered, unorganized. John knew they were out of their element now. Confusion was his ally. From his position, John could see the way they communicated. Panicked hand signals, whispered commands that were drowned out by the sound of their own hasty steps. They were rushing to get into position, but they were moving blindly, like sheep led into a slaughterhouse. John moved again, this time closer to the barn. He had to take out the remaining men before they regrouped. He moved silently, his body low to the ground, taking advantage of the dark shadows cast by the trees and the barn. The next shot came from a different direction, his rifle aimed at the head of one of the cartel members who had ventured too far from the rest of the group. 3 down. The sound of gunfire echoed in the night, but John didn't wait to see the results. His mind was already calculating the next move. There were only 2 left, and they were too close to the barn for comfort. John slid around the corner of the barn, his footsteps muffled by the thick grass beneath his boots. He could hear them now, voices low, but unmistakable. They were nearing the main entrance of the barn. One man was looking at the ground, trying to track the direction of the shots. The other stood near the door, his back to John. This was it. John quickly closed the distance, his rifle at the ready. 1 shot, 2 shots, done. The men were no longer a threat. John stood over their bodies for a moment, breathing heavily as the adrenaline began to fade. He wiped his brow and surveyed the battlefield. His pulse was still high, but his mind was already moving to the next step. The fight wasn't over. He knew that. He could feel it in his bones. The moment he thought he had control, the moment he thought he had eliminated all the threats, there was always another. He pulled out his phone again, dialing Chris's number. This time, the call went straight to voicemail. John didn't leave a message. He needed to know if this attack was just the beginning, if they were done here, or if more reinforcements were on their way. He glanced at the trucks, their engines still idling. The fight was over for now, but he was far from being in the clear. There was something else going on here, something much bigger than just a cartel trying to control territory, and he needed to find out who was behind it. John didn't have the luxury of time to sit and wait. The fact that Chris hadn't answered his call only added to the weight on his shoulders. The cartel might be down for now, but there were still more questions than answers. He could feel the creeping tension in the air, the kind that comes just before a storm. His thoughts were racing as he paced around the remains of the battlefield. Cartel bodies scattered across the ground, their once intimidating presence now reduced to the remnants of a failed attack. John took a deep breath and moved toward one of the trucks. Information. That's what he needed. If there was anything left that could tell him who sent these men, it would be in the truck. The leader, whoever that was, would have been the one to plan this out, to make sure everything ran smoothly. There had to be something left behind that would connect the dots. He opened the truck door and found the interior cluttered with weapons, ammunition, and supplies. Nothing out of the ordinary for a cartel operation. But then his eyes caught something that made his pulse quicken. A small black bag tucked beneath the driver's seat. John's fingers gripped the bag, pulling it out and flipping it open. Inside was a laptop. He raised an eyebrow, his heart pounding. It was far from a typical item for a cartel soldier. Cartels dealt in physical force and intimidation, not in cyber intelligence. But whoever sent these men had clearly underestimated his ability to see past the obvious. John took the laptop, moving swiftly back to the barn where he could find more cover. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. The screen lit up, revealing a password prompt. John's fingers worked quickly, tapping in a series of codes, things he had memorized over the years. It didn't take long before the screen blinked and opened up. Files. A trove of them. Business transactions, communications, maps, and a series of encrypted messages. John leaned in, scanning the documents quickly. Most of it was unimportant, but there were a few that stood out. Names, places, dates. His eyes zeroed in on one file titled Operation Phoenix. He clicked it open. The file contained details that made John's stomach churn. There were references to a private military contractor that had been hired to eliminate him. But it wasn't just about the cartel. This was something more. The messages spoke of a corporate interest, something related to a multinational company operating out of the U.S. They were working with the cartel, but there were more powerful players involved. And the one name that kept cropping up in these communications was Everett Hayes. John's blood ran cold. Everett Hayes. It wasn't just some random name. Hayes was a former military contractor who had worked alongside John during his Delta Force days. But more than that, he had been involved in shady, off-the-books operations, often dealing with people who operated in the dark. And when John had left the military, he had thought Hayes was gone, buried with the rest of the black ops projects he had left behind. But clearly, Hayes had survived. And he was orchestrating something that had now brought the cartel to John's doorstep. John gritted his teeth. This was bigger than he had imagined. The cartel wasn't just a random attack. They were a tool, a weapon used by someone much more dangerous. Someone who knew John's past all too well. With a deep sigh, John closed the laptop and quickly slipped it into his pack. He couldn't stay here any longer. Hayes wasn't the kind of person who left loose ends. And now, John had made himself one. His phone buzzed again, cutting through the tension. This time, it was Chris calling back. John answered without hesitation. "Chris, I've got something." "I'm listening," Chris replied, his voice steady. But John could tell he was already in motion, gathering intel on his end. "The cartel wasn't just after me," John began, his voice low. "This goes deeper. There's someone else behind all this, someone I know. Everett Hayes. He's working with the cartel. But it's not just a cartel operation. There's a bigger plan here, corporate, military. I don't know what yet, but I'm getting closer." Chris was silent for a moment, digesting the information. Everett Hayes? Damn, that guy's bad news. He's connected to a lot of dirty stuff. Black ops, shady contracts. If he's involved, then we're talking about something way bigger than the cartels. "John, you need to be careful." John's mind was already working ahead, thinking of their next move. "I don't have time to be careful. Hayes knows my every move. I need to track him down, Chris. I need answers, and I need them fast." "I'm pulling every string I can, John," Chris replied, his voice taking on a more urgent tone. "I'll start digging into Hayes's activities. But we need to move quickly. He won't just sit back and let you figure this out. If he knows you're after him, he's going to come after you harder." John's jaw tightened. He didn't have the luxury of waiting. "I'll be in touch soon. Stay safe, Chris." Before Chris could respond, John ended the call and immediately began to prepare for the next phase of his plan. He couldn't afford to wait for backup. If Hayes was truly behind this, then he would be ready for whatever came next. John gathered his gear and took a final look around the farm. The place he had once thought was his sanctuary was now a battlefield, and there was no turning back. John loaded his rifle, double-checked his gear, and locked the barn door behind him. He wasn't sure how long it would be before the cartel realized their men were missing, but he wasn't planning to stick around to find out. His heart raced with purpose now as he ran through the information in his mind. The name Everett Hayes was more than just a name from his past. It was a key, an access point into something far darker than a mere cartel raid. He needed to find Hayes before Hayes found him. His first move was to get off the farm. Hayes would have connections watching every exit, every route John could take. There were no guarantees anymore, and staying in one place for too long was the same as putting a target on his back. John's truck roared to life as he drove away, tires kicking up dust behind him. The landscape blurred by as he drove through winding backroads, staying off the main highways. He kept the speed low, using the cover of the dense woods and rural farmlands to his advantage. It was one thing to fight in open terrain. It was another to track someone through the shadows. As John drove, his mind kept returning to the data he had pulled from the cartel's laptop. Everett Hayes had been operating in the shadows for years, working on high-level military contracts that never reached the light of day. But it was clear now that Hayes wasn't just looking for money or power. He was setting something up. The cartel was a means to an end, and John was likely the end goal. What was Hayes planning? John couldn't shake the feeling that his entire life had led him to this point. Whatever this was, he had fought for years in places the world had forgotten. But this felt personal. Suddenly, John's phone buzzed again. His pulse spiked as he saw Chris's name on the screen. "Chris." John answered quickly, trying to mask the urgency in his voice. "John," Chris's voice crackled through the line. "I've been digging into Hayes for the past hour, and I've got something. He's been involved in private operations for the U.S. government, but there's a catch. He's got a history of working with corporate entities, not just the military. Companies with resources you wouldn't believe. And it looks like one of those companies might be backing the cartel you just took down." John's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "You're telling me Hayes has corporate backing?" "Exactly," Chris said. "Whoever's funding him is someone with deep pockets. And this isn't just about drugs or territory. This is about something much bigger, something that involves military-grade tech and operations. The kind of things that the government itself probably doesn't even know about." John's mind raced. Corporate interests in military tech. He'd seen enough of those kinds of deals go sour in the past. When money and power mixed, nothing good came of it. Hayes was playing a game with bigger stakes than he had ever imagined. "I need to know where Hayes is right now," John said, his voice sharp. "We're not talking about just any operation. He's out for something specific, and I need to stop him before it goes any further." Chris paused. "I'm tracking him now, but he's not easy to follow. Hayes is careful. He has his own methods of covering his tracks. But I've got an old contact who might know where he's been hiding." "Get me a location," John said, pushing his foot harder on the gas. "Time is running out." "I'm on it," Chris replied. "But John, be careful. Hayes will be expecting you. He's not the kind of man who leaves things to chance. If he knows you're onto him, you'll be walking straight into his hands." John clenched his jaw. He wasn't about to back down. He'd faced impossible odds before, and this time would be no different. If Hayes wanted a fight, John would give him one. The road in front of John started to stretch out, leading him to a small, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Chris had given him a rough location, but there was no telling what kind of mess Hayes had left behind. He could be walking straight into a trap, but it was a risk John was willing to take. As he neared the warehouse, John slowed the truck, parking a few hundred yards away. He wasn't stupid. He wouldn't drive right up to the front door. His eyes scanned the area through the truck's rearview mirror. It was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that made his skin crawl. He grabbed his gear, strapped his rifle to his back, and slid out of the truck. Every step he took was calculated, deliberate. He moved low, staying in the shadows as he approached the warehouse. His mind was clear, focused on the task ahead. No distractions. No second guesses. The faint sound of footsteps reached his ears as he neared the building. John froze, his instincts kicking in. Someone was inside. He didn't have time to waste. He needed to move fast, get in, and get out. With a deep breath, he pushed open the creaking door of the warehouse, the old hinges protesting as they strained against the weight. The space inside was dimly lit, with large crates stacked high around the perimeter. The air smelled stale, old, untouched for years. But there was something more to the scent now, something sharp and metallic. Blood? John's fingers gripped the rifle tightly as he moved forward, his eyes scanning every corner. He was close. Whoever was inside had to know he was coming. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as the sound of muffled voices came from deeper within the building. This was it. He was about to find out who else had been involved in this nightmare. And he wasn't about to leave until he had every answer he needed. John's every sense was heightened as he crept deeper into the warehouse. His eyes flicked from shadow to shadow, his body tensed with anticipation. He could hear the muffled voices more clearly now, low, urgent whispers. Someone was inside, and they knew something was about to go down. But they didn't know it was John they were up against. John slowed his breathing, moving inch by inch toward the noise. The crates loomed in front of him like silent sentinels, casting long shadows across the floor. The air smelled of dust and something metallic, blood, sweat, and fear. His hand gripped his rifle tighter, the stock cold against his shoulder. As he rounded a corner, the faint light from a single overhead bulb revealed a small group of men gathered around a table. They were heavily armed, some with rifles, others with pistols. In the center of the table, John could see maps, documents, and a laptop open to a specific screen. He stopped dead in his tracks. It was a blueprint. The image on the screen was of something large, something that looked like an underground facility, and the word Phoenix was scrawled across the top. The same operation Hayes had mentioned before, but there was no time to study it. The men were talking in low voices, unaware of John's presence. The most vocal of the group was tall, broad-shouldered, with a scar running down his cheek. He had the look of someone who had been in the game far too long. His voice was low, almost growling. "We've got to move fast. Hayes is on a tight schedule," the man said, his finger tapping a spot on the map. "The Americans won't know what hit them. We've got everything we need." John's heart skipped a beat. The Americans? They weren't just talking about a cartel deal. This wasn't about territory or drugs anymore. The operation had expanded. There were far more powerful players involved, and they were preparing for something huge. John took another step forward, but the floorboard creaked underfoot. A harsh, startled whisper shot through the room. "Who's there?" the man with the scar barked. John didn't wait for them to react. He moved in an instant, drawing his rifle and firing 2 quick shots in rapid succession. The first man dropped before he could even raise his weapon. The second, who had been closest to the laptop, went down with a bullet to the chest. The others scrambled, reaching for their own weapons, but John was faster. He dropped another one in a fluid motion, his rifle now raised high, scanning the room for any movement. There were 3 left, but they weren't backing down. They moved with the kind of deadly precision that only years of experience could teach. One of them bolted toward the exit, no doubt trying to get reinforcements. John wasn't going to let that happen. He fired off another shot, hitting the man square in the back before he reached the door. The last 2 men opened fire, their shots hitting the walls and crates around John. But he was already moving, using the shadows to his advantage, keeping low. His rifle tracked the remaining men, one aiming from behind cover, the other circling around to his right. One of them was going to make a mistake. John waited. Then, in a flash, he popped up from behind cover, firing off 2 rapid shots. One man collapsed to the floor with a bullet in his neck. The final man's eyes widened in panic, realizing he was trapped. He raised his hands, dropping his weapon, but it was too late. "Talk," John commanded. his voice low but deadly. The man, gasping for breath, looked at John with a mix of fear and defiance. He seemed to hesitate for a moment before speaking. "You won't win this. Hayes, he's already planned everything. This is bigger than you think. You're just a distraction." John's grip tightened on his rifle, but he didn't fire. He needed information. "Where is Hayes?" The man scoffed, almost laughing at the absurdity of it. "You think you can stop him? You think you can stop the corporate machine behind him? Hayes doesn't care about you or the cartel. He's playing a bigger game, and you're just a pawn." John's eyes narrowed. This was the second time he had heard the mention of something bigger, something involving corporate interests. He'd suspected it before, but now the full extent of it was clear. Whoever was backing Hayes was playing on a level far beyond what John could have imagined. "Where is he?" John repeated, this time with a deadly edge. The man looked him in the eye for a long moment, then his gaze dropped to the floor. "He's already made his move. You won't get to him in time." John's pulse quickened. Hayes was on the move, and every second counted. But before he could press the man for more information, he heard something that made his blood run cold. A faint sound, a rumble. Then, suddenly, the warehouse doors slammed open with a deafening crash. John's heart sank. He didn't have to turn around to know what was coming. He didn't have much time. More men were coming. The echoes of heavy boots, the unmistakable sound of military-grade equipment. Hayes had sent a response team. John had been so focused on eliminating the immediate threat that he had overlooked the most obvious mistake. The reinforcements? John sprinted to the shadows, moving as fast as he could, but his mind raced faster. He needed to finish what he started. Hayes was still out there, but the game had just changed. It was no longer just about survival. It was about stopping something far worse from unfolding. As the doors slammed shut behind him, John dove for cover, preparing for the storm that was about to break loose. Every part of him screamed that this was only the beginning, and he had no idea how deep the rabbit hole went. But one thing was clear. He was going to stop Hayes, no matter the cost. The convoy stretched out ahead of John like a snake slithering through the darkened road, its headlights cutting through the night. His heart beat in time with the thrum of the engine beneath him as he pushed the truck faster. The roar of the diesel engine drowned out everything else, the crickets, the wind, the ominous silence in the distance. All that mattered now was the goal ahead, stopping Hayes. As John closed in on the convoy, he could make out the details of the trucks, dark military-grade vehicles, heavily armored, carrying valuable cargo. Each truck was flanked by armed guards, their silhouettes barely visible through the windows. They hadn't noticed him yet, but that wouldn't last long. John didn't hesitate. He slammed the truck into gear and swerved, steering the vehicle off-road and charging straight for the rear of the convoy. His mind was sharp, focused. No second-guessing. No time for mistakes. The first truck's tail lights flared as John's vehicle collided with it, sending the truck spinning into a ditch. The screech of metal against metal was deafening, but John didn't flinch. He was already moving on to the next target. Behind him, the convoy erupted in chaos, honking horns and flashing lights. The soldiers inside scrambled, drawing weapons, trying to figure out what was happening. It was the perfect distraction. John didn't wait for them to recover. He slammed on the brakes and slid the truck sideways, blocking the path of the second vehicle in the convoy. He was quick, grabbing his rifle and darting out of the truck. In seconds, he was behind cover, watching the convoy's soldiers approach. The first guard that came around the corner didn't see John until it was too late. A quick, silent shot to the head, and he dropped without a sound. The second soldier fared no better. John's movements were fluid, instinctive, a veteran at work. As he moved from cover to cover, taking out one soldier after another, his thoughts stayed on the mission. Hayes, the man behind it all. Hayes was still somewhere ahead, somewhere in one of those trucks, or maybe in the back of the convoy's operations. John's eyes flicked to the remaining trucks. He had to get closer. There were only 4 trucks left, and 2 were already trying to break formation, veering off the road to escape. John couldn't let them get away. The mission wasn't over until he had them all. He sprinted forward, moving in between the trucks, using the thick, low brush on the side of the road to stay hidden. A third truck tried to push forward, but John was already there. With a swift movement, he hopped into the cab of the vehicle, taking control of the wheel. The driver didn't have time to react. John kicked him out and shoved the truck into reverse, ramming it directly into the remaining trucks. The explosion that followed was deafening. A fiery blast erupted as the vehicles collided, sending debris and fireballs into the sky. The force of the blast knocked John back, but he was already on his feet, moving quickly, scanning the wreckage. He couldn't let the explosion slow him down. In the distance, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure, standing tall in the chaos, walking with the kind of slow confidence that only someone who had orchestrated all of this could possess. Hayes. John's pulse surged with adrenaline as he saw the man who had masterminded this whole operation. Hayes had finally shown himself, and there was no turning back now. John bolted forward, weaving in and out of the wreckage, his eyes locked on Hayes. The man was wearing military fatigues, his face calm, unreadable. He wasn't running. He wasn't scared. He was waiting. This was it. John reached the front of the convoy, his weapon ready, his breath coming in heavy gasps. Hayes saw him approaching, but didn't flinch. Instead, he simply tilted his head, a faint, almost amused smile crossing his lips. "You really think you can stop this?" Hayes's voice was smooth, almost as if he was having a casual conversation. "You're too late." John narrowed his eyes, gripping his rifle tighter. "What the hell are you trying to pull, Hayes?" Hayes's smile grew. "You still don't get it, do you? This is bigger than you. Bigger than the cartel. This is about control. Power. The kind that doesn't rely on governments or borders." John's gut twisted. "You're insane. You've been using the cartel as a pawn in some twisted game. You're risking everything for what?" "Everything is a risk," Hayes replied coolly. "And it's all worth it. The money, the power. It's all just a means to an end. I'm building something that no one will be able to touch. Not the government. Not the military. Not even you." John's eyes flicked to the nearby explosion, the flames rising in the distance. "And what happens when it all falls apart? What happens when the very people you've used come after you?" Hayes's expression darkened. "The system doesn't work unless you control it. And I will control it. If you're not with me, you're in my way. And I don't have time for people who are in my way." Before John could react, Hayes turned his back, walking toward a nearby truck, his movements deliberate. "You're out of time. They're coming. And this is only the beginning." John's mind raced. The last thing he needed was more enemies. He couldn't afford to let Hayes escape. Not when he was so close. But then, just as John moved toward him, the unmistakable sound of helicopters filled the air. The air was thick with the whirling noise as dark figures dropped from the sky, landing in perfect formation. The cavalry had arrived. Hayes didn't look back, stepping into the truck and slamming the door behind him. John cursed under his breath, his mind racing. He had to make a choice: stop Hayes now or risk losing him forever. The air was thick with tension as John stood there, watching Hayes climb into the truck. His heart raced, and his mind worked overtime. The choppers were closing in fast, their blades slicing through the night air like a death sentence. Hayes was getting away, and if John didn't act now, he might never get another shot at him. Without thinking, John sprinted toward the wreckage of a nearby vehicle, ducking low as bullets tore through the air around him. He could hear the faint crackle of radio chatter. Hayes was already communicating with someone. That meant he had backup, and that meant more trouble than John had prepared for. The helicopters were circling now, descending in a tight formation, their powerful searchlights scanning the ground below. Each flash illuminated the chaos in front of him. The wrecked convoy, the dead cartel soldiers, the flaming trucks. The heat from the fires hit John's skin like a wave, but he pushed forward. He had no choice. He couldn't let Hayes slip through his fingers now. John reached a burned-out car and took cover, watching as Hayes's truck began to move slowly, the tires crunching over the gravel. He could see the men inside the helicopters now, their figures silhouetted against the bright lights. They were all waiting for something, waiting for Hayes to give the signal. John's grip tightened on his rifle. He had to stop Hayes. The helicopter's searchlights flickered and shifted, and for a split second, John saw his chance. One of the choppers was passing overhead, its light momentarily aimed at the convoy's wreckage. Without hesitation, John dove from his cover, running low to the ground, and aimed directly at the nearest chopper. The rifle's recoil hit him like a punch to the shoulder as he fired, his aim steady despite the chaos. The bullet struck the chopper's engine, and with a shriek of metal, it began to spiral, its searchlight flickering before it exploded in a massive burst of flames. The other helicopters scrambled in the sky, their pilots swerving and diving to avoid the same fate. The night was alive with the sound of chopper blades and gunfire as the remaining helicopters began to circle, trying to regain control. John didn't wait to see what happened next. He sprinted toward Hayes's truck, moving faster now, adrenaline pushing him forward. He was almost there. The truck was slowing down, no doubt trying to avoid being hit, but Hayes hadn't yet realized what was happening. He was distracted by the chaos above. John reached the truck in seconds. His breath came in short bursts, but he wasn't slowing down. With one fluid motion, he hopped onto the side of the vehicle, climbing up the ladder-like frame to the truck's cab. The driver barely had time to react before John's rifle but slammed into his face, sending him crashing to the side, unconscious. John threw open the door and yanked Hayes out of the truck. The man was caught off guard, but his eyes remained cold, calculating. He didn't beg. He didn't flinch. Instead, he laughed, a low, unsettling chuckle that echoed in the midst of the chaos. "You think this is it, don't you?" Hayes spat, wiping blood from his lip. "You really think you can stop what's already in motion?" John's grip tightened on Hayes's collar, dragging him toward the wreckage. "I don't care what you think. I'm not letting you get away with this." Hayes's smile only widened. "You have no idea what you're up against. You think I'm the head of this operation? You think I'm the one calling the shots?" He paused, letting the words sink in. "This isn't about me. I'm just a player. You've been chasing the wrong person the whole time." John's heart skipped a beat. The weight of Hayes's words hit him like a freight train. If Hayes wasn't the real mastermind, then who the hell was? Before John could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps broke through the tension. He spun around, rifle raised, ready for anything. But it wasn't soldiers. A tall figure emerged from the shadows, stepping forward slowly, his hands raised in surrender. It was Adrian Blackwell. John's mind whirred. Blackwell? The name sounded vaguely familiar, but John couldn't place it. Blackwell was dressed in a tailored black suit, his expression calm and composed despite the chaos surrounding them. He wasn't a soldier or a cartel member. He was something far more dangerous. Hayes's smile faded as he saw the new arrival. "So, the puppet master shows up." John's eyes narrowed. "Who the hell are you?" Blackwell's smile was polite, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm the one pulling the strings," he said, his voice smooth, almost too calm for the situation. "And you've been very inconvenient." John tensed, the pieces of the puzzle starting to click together. This wasn't just a cartel operation. This was a much larger conspiracy, one that went deeper than he could have ever imagined. Blackwell took a step forward, his eyes glinting in the light of the burning wreckage. "You've been chasing shadows, Mr. Miller. The real game is happening above your pay grade." John's pulse quickened. "What the hell are you talking about?" Blackwell's smile deepened. "You've uncovered a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole picture. The power that Hayes and his team have been using, it's just the tip of the iceberg, and you're too far in now to walk away. There's no escaping this." John knew Blackwell was trying to mess with his head, but every fiber of his being screamed that this was the moment everything had been leading to. This was bigger than the cartels, bigger than Hayes. Whoever Blackwell was working for, they had the power to move mountains and destroy anyone in their way. Before John could react, the sound of more helicopters filled the air, their blades thundering above them. A new wave of soldiers was descending, armed, prepared, and determined. They had backup, and they weren't here to negotiate. Blackwell stepped back, his smile fading as he turned toward the approaching soldiers. "I'll leave you to deal with this, Miller," he said with a cold glance. "But remember this. When you chase something, you'd better be ready for the truth. Because the truth, well, the truth is always more dangerous than you think." John barely had time to register the words before Blackwell disappeared into the chaos, vanishing into the shadows. The storm was just beginning. The sound of helicopters roaring overhead felt like a distant drumbeat, drowning out the chaos below. John's heart pounded in his chest as he stood, rifle raised, scanning the growing cloud of dust and smoke. The flames from the wreckage cast a hellish glow across the scene, painting everything in shades of orange and red. Blackwell had disappeared into the shadows, leaving John with more questions than answers. But there was no time to dwell on that. The incoming soldiers, more heavily armed, more organized, were moving in quickly. Their mission was clear: neutralize John, secure the area, and finish what Hayes had started. John's mind raced. The truth Blackwell hinted at, what was it? Was Hayes just a pawn in a bigger game? And if so, who was truly behind the operation? The layers of deception were thick, and every move John made only revealed more questions. But there was no time to reflect. He had a fight to survive, and the soldiers weren't going to wait for him to figure it all out. The first wave of soldiers descended, landing with precision as their boots hit the ground. They were in full tactical gear, armed with automatic rifles and sidearms. They didn't look like mere foot soldiers. They looked like professionals, special forces, maybe. John's pulse quickened. This wasn't just about stopping Hayes anymore. He dropped to a crouch, scanning the environment. There was too much open ground, too many places for them to hide. He needed to stay one step ahead, but the odds were quickly stacking up against him. The first two soldiers took cover behind a set of charred vehicles, their rifles raised, scanning for any movement. John's training kicked in. He didn't hesitate. He fired, taking down the first soldier with a clean shot to the chest. The second soldier ducked, returning fire, but John was already moving, ducking behind a stack of crates. The ground shook with the force of another helicopter landing nearby. More soldiers. More firepower. John gritted his teeth, forcing himself to focus. "Think, Miller, think," he muttered under his breath. The adrenaline coursing through his veins sharpened his senses. He could hear the soldiers shouting orders to each other. They were closing in. In the distance, he saw a figure moving in the shadows, slipping between the wreckage. It was too fast to be a soldier. It had to be Blackwell, or someone working for him. John's eyes locked onto the figure. He couldn't let Blackwell get away. But before he could make a move, a burst of gunfire rang out, narrowly missing his head. The second wave of soldiers had arrived, and they weren't giving him any room to breathe. He pulled himself behind the cover of an overturned truck, heart racing. The situation was spiraling out of control, but he couldn't afford to back down. Not now. He needed a plan. He glanced around, spotting a cluster of grenades scattered on the ground by the wreckage. He reached for one, pulling it into his hand and quickly pulling the pin. The grenade was a gamble, but it was his best shot. With a swift motion, John threw the grenade toward the center of the advancing soldiers. There was a brief moment of silence before the explosion rocked the area. The blast sent shockwaves through the air, knocking several soldiers off their feet and disorienting the others. This was his opening. John sprinted forward, ducking low, moving fast through the smoke and chaos. He aimed his rifle at the first soldier he saw, a man scrambling to recover from the blast. One shot, a clean hit. The soldier collapsed, and John was already moving again. As he rounded a corner, he came face to face with another group of soldiers. They were too close, too many. The odds were stacking up against him, but he wasn't about to let them take him down. John dove for cover behind a large shipping container, his mind racing for a way out of this. He couldn't keep fighting forever. Eventually, the numbers would catch up to him. That's when he saw it. A lone military vehicle parked on the outskirts of the convoy, its engine running. He didn't think. He just moved. John sprinted toward the vehicle, ignoring the gunfire ringing in his ears. He reached the driver's side door, yanking it open and throwing the driver out. The man barely had time to react before John was in the seat, slamming the door shut and flooring the gas pedal. The vehicle roared to life, tearing across the terrain, its wheels kicking up dust and debris. John's heart raced as he sped toward the remaining soldiers, trying to push the fear down. If he could break through their lines, he might have a chance to escape. But the soldiers weren't giving up that easily. A bullet struck the vehicle's side, ricocheting off the metal with a sharp clang. John swerved to avoid another volley of gunfire, his hands tight on the wheel. Ahead, the convoy stretched out in front of him. The remaining trucks and helicopters were still in motion, and the soldiers on the ground were regrouping, forming a perimeter. John's mind was a blur of possibilities. He needed an exit plan. He was close, so close to breaking through. But there was still Blackwell, still Hayes's elusive plan, still the mystery of what lay beyond this battle. John slammed the accelerator, charging straight for the convoy. The truck ahead of him screeched as John collided with it, sending it spinning off the road. The vehicle flipped, rolling end over end in a fiery explosion. The impact was enough to send the rest of the convoy into disarray, the soldiers scattering in every direction. John didn't stop to watch the carnage. He pushed forward, the truck barreling through the smoke, the soldiers now caught in confusion. He had one shot to escape, and this was it. But as he approached the final barrier, a figure stepped out of the smoke ahead of him. Blackwell. John's pulse spiked. Blackwell was standing in the middle of the road, his arms outstretched as if he were waiting for the inevitable collision. John didn't hesitate. He swerved at the last second, narrowly avoiding Blackwell, but the near miss sent the vehicle careening out of control. The truck flipped once, twice, and then crashed violently into the ground, the world spinning into chaos. John's vision blurred. His head spun, the world around him going dark. But through the haze of pain and confusion, he heard it. The sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Blackwell. John fought to stay conscious, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. But it was too late. The barrel of a gun pressed against the side of his head. "You had a good run, Miller." Blackwell's voice was cold, without mercy. "But this is where it ends." The night was suffocating, the air thick with smoke and the metallic scent of blood. John's every step felt like a battle as he moved through the wreckage, rifle in hand, his mind spinning. The world around him was an inferno, burning bright under the sky that seemed to crackle with energy, but within, he felt the creeping cold of uncertainty. The helicopters hadn't left. They were still up there, hovering like vultures, scanning for any movement below. They weren't done with him yet. John needed to get out of the open. He couldn't stay here. If Blackwell had connections that went beyond the cartel, then every minute spent here was a minute closer to his own death. The soldiers he'd fought off earlier were regrouping, and the convoy that Blackwell had set into motion was still a major threat. He looked around, assessing his options. In the distance, he saw what might be a way out, a patch of thick trees that would give him the cover he desperately needed. It was risky, but the alternative was facing down another wave of soldiers, or worse, getting caught in the open. He didn't have time to second-guess. John moved quickly but cautiously, ducking low as he sprinted toward the tree line. The sound of helicopters was deafening now, each thud of their blades making the ground vibrate beneath his feet. His eyes darted upward, calculating the angle. They were still focused on the wreckage, but they'd sweep this area soon enough. John took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. Focus. Think. Every mission he'd been on had taught him this. Survival was about controlling your fear. And right now, fear would get him killed. As he neared the tree line, a figure appeared from the shadows. John froze, rifle raised, heart racing. His body reacted before his mind could process what was happening. A soldier? A cartel member? The figure stepped forward, hands raised in surrender. It was a woman. She wasn't in tactical gear like the others. No, she was dressed in civilian clothes, but there was a hardness in her gaze, a readiness that betrayed the fact she was anything but an innocent bystander. "Don't shoot," she said, her voice calm but urgent. "I'm not here to hurt you." John didn't lower his rifle. Trust? Not yet. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice rough, the adrenaline still surging through his veins. "My name is Clara." She didn't flinch under his gaze, her eyes locked onto his. "I was sent to help you." John narrowed his eyes. "By who?" Clara hesitated, then looked over her shoulder, as if making sure no one else was watching. "By people who want Blackwell gone. People who want to stop this before it spreads any further." John's mind raced. Another faction? A bigger web? I don't have time for games, John growled. Who are these people? And why should I trust you? Clara's gaze hardened, and she stepped closer, her tone growing more serious. You don't have to trust me yet, but if you want to survive this, you need to listen. There's a larger force behind all of this, something that stretches beyond what you've seen. Cartels, mercenaries, governments, they're all part of it. And Blackwell was just one small player in the grand scheme. John's eyes flicked to the trees around them, scanning for any signs of danger. She wasn't making this easy, but her words, they felt like a warning, like she knew something he didn't. Something bigger. I'm listening, he said, his voice tight. Clara nodded, then motioned for him to follow her. Come with me. You need to meet with the people who can help you take Blackwell down. It's not just him anymore. It's a network, and they're ready to bring down anyone who stands in their way. John's instinct screamed at him to stay on guard, to be ready for anything. But he had no choice. He needed to know the truth. What was Blackwell really involved in? What was this larger conspiracy? He followed Clara through the thick underbrush, the sound of helicopters growing fainter the farther they moved into the trees. They reached a small clearing, where a nondescript SUV was parked, its engine running. Get in, Clara said, her voice almost a command now. We'll take you to the people who can help. John hesitated, his mind racing. This could be a trap. It could be the end. But the alternative was staying out here, exposed, with a dozen enemies closing in. The clock was ticking. He climbed into the SUV, Clara sliding in next to him. As the vehicle sped off, the sounds of the battle behind them slowly faded, replaced by the steady hum of the engine. The ride was tense, the silence between them thick. John kept his eyes on the road, his mind working through everything he had learned so far. Blackwell had to be connected to something bigger. Clara didn't speak at first, letting the tension hang in the air. It wasn't until they reached the outskirts of a small town that she finally broke the silence. There are people you don't want to mess with, Clara said softly. And Blackwell was one of them. But he was also expendable. They'll be coming for you next. John's brow furrowed. Who are they? The people who run things behind the scenes, Clara replied. Governments, corporations, criminal organizations, they're all working together. They're pulling the strings. Blackwell? He was just a tool to them. And now that he's gone, they'll come for you. John's mind raced. A global conspiracy. This was bigger than he'd ever imagined. He thought he was just up against a cartel, a group of criminals. But what Clara was saying, what she was implying, was far more dangerous. So what's next? John asked, his voice steady but filled with the weight of what was to come. Clara glanced at him, her eyes narrowing. Now? Now we find out who's really behind this, and we stop them before they destroy everything. The car sped through the night, heading toward an uncertain future. But one thing was clear. John had just entered a war that no one could afford to ignore. The drive was long, the landscape outside the SUV changing from rugged, smoky mountains to the flat, eerie silence of the plains. They passed through desolate, empty streets and past small rural homes that seemed to belong to another world. One completely disconnected from the chaos John had left behind. It was as if the rest of the world hadn't yet realized the storm that was brewing. Or maybe it just didn't care. Clara didn't say much during the drive, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. John could feel her calculating, piecing together information. She was clearly playing a much larger game than he was, but there was a quiet confidence in her movements that made him wonder just how deep she was into this thing. John, for his part, was silent too, absorbing what he had learned so far. A global conspiracy. Governments, corporations, criminal organizations working together, all pulling strings from the shadows. Blackwell wasn't the mastermind. He was merely a tool in a much larger machine. It was a terrifying thought. But one thing gnawed at John. If Blackwell was just one player in a much bigger operation, then what role had he been playing? What had he been tasked with? And who else was out there? And, most pressing, who was coming after him next? He glanced over at Clara, who seemed lost in her own thoughts. He still wasn't sure if he could trust her. But she had told him something important, something that had stayed with him during their drive. They'll come for you next. His grip tightened on his rifle, lying beside him on the seat. His instincts screamed at him to be prepared for anything. If he was being hunted, he needed to make sure he wasn't the one being stalked. The SUV finally slowed as they approached a gated compound. The fence was high, topped with barbed wire, and a pair of armed guards stood at the entrance, eyeing the vehicle as it approached. Clara didn't slow down, barely glancing at the guards. She simply waved her hand in the air, and a guard stepped forward to open the gate without question. John's brow furrowed. Who the hell was Clara? And why was she allowed into a place like this without a second glance? The SUV rolled into a small but heavily fortified compound. Buildings that looked modern, yet a little too quiet, with windows blacked out. There were a few other vehicles scattered around, but other than the faint sound of generators humming in the background, the place was eerily still. "Stay close," Clara said softly as they parked. John nodded, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle again, though he knew better than to raise it in this unfamiliar place. They got out of the vehicle, and Clara led him inside the building. There was a sense of urgency in her movements, but it wasn't fear. It was control, as if she knew exactly what needed to be done next. They entered a room that was stark, with a few metal desks, computers, and a group of individuals hunched over their screens. The place had a sterile, utilitarian feel to it, far from what John expected from a clandestine operation. At the center of the room stood a man, his back to them. He was tall, sharply dressed in military fatigues, and had a presence that was impossible to ignore. He turned as they entered, locking eyes with John immediately. "This is him?" the man asked, his voice low and gravelly. Clara nodded. "Miller. He's the one I told you about. He's the right person for this." The man studied John for a moment before offering a slight nod. "You've been through a hell of a lot, and I'm sure there's more coming." John didn't respond immediately. Instead, he sized the man up, his instincts telling him that this was someone who held a significant amount of power, someone who could either help him or destroy him. "I'm Commander Graves," the man said, his voice hard but not unfriendly. "You're going to want to listen very carefully. The situation you're in is far worse than you think. Blackwell was only one small cog in this machine. What you're facing now is a global network. It reaches into governments, corporations, intelligence agencies. Nothing is off limits." John crossed his arms, keeping his expression neutral. "Who are they?" "The ones Blackwell was working for." Graves stepped forward, a look of grim understanding passing over his features. "We don't have a full picture yet, but we know enough. There's a group, an international shadow organization that's been operating in the background for decades. Their aim is control of power, control of information, control of the global stage. They orchestrate wars, manipulate governments, and even use organizations like the cartels as tools to get what they want. Blackwell was just a tool, one of many they've used." John felt a chill run down his spine. A shadow organization. The words echoed in his mind, and he had no doubt that Graves was telling the truth. The web he had stumbled into was much deeper than anything he could have imagined. "So what now?" John asked, his voice cold with determination. Graves looked at him, his expression hardening. "Now, we stop them, and we start by hunting down every person involved. We find out who's behind Blackwell, and we bring them down. We dismantle this network before they can do any more damage." John's gaze shifted to the group of individuals hunched over their computers. They were working quickly, coordinating, gathering intelligence. Clara stepped closer to him, her voice low. "The people who run this network are everywhere. Some of them may already know who you are, what you're capable of. You're not just up against mercenaries or cartel soldiers. You're going after the people who pull the strings in governments, in major corporations. It's bigger than anything you've faced." John thought about everything he had gone through, the battles, the betrayals, the lies. He had faced death in every form imaginable, but this was different. He exhaled slowly. "What's the first step?" Graves looked at him with a solemn expression. "First, we gather everything we can on their next move, and then we get you ready. This won't be easy, but we're going to need everything you've got if we want to bring them down." John nodded. There was no turning back now. The stakes had just gone global, And whatever this shadow organization was, it wasn't going to go down without a fight. But neither was John. The room was quiet, the only sound the clicking of keys as the team of operatives worked feverishly at their computers. Their faces were lit by the glow of the screens, eyes focused and tense. John stood off to the side, leaning against the wall, arms crossed over his chest. The gravity of what he was about to face weighed on him, but there was no turning back now. Graves had left them to work, giving the team the space to analyze every scrap of intelligence they had gathered so far. And Clara, who had been his guide through this labyrinth of shadows, stood beside him, her expression as hard as ever. She wasn't giving anything away, not yet, anyway. John couldn't shake the feeling that every answer he got only led to more questions. Who were these people? What did they want? The magnitude of their reach was something he couldn't fully comprehend, but the more he learned, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about Blackwell or the cartel, or even mercenaries. It was a war being fought in the shadows. A war for control. After what seemed like an eternity, one of the analysts looked up from her screen. She was a woman in her mid-30s, her short black hair tucked behind her ears. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were sharp. She stood up, pushing her chair back with a screech that broke the silence. "We've got something," she said, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. "It's about Blackwell's connections. We traced his transactions and communications back to an encrypted network. We're still trying to breach it, but we've got a name." John's heart skipped. A name. He'd been hoping for something concrete, something he could use. The woman stepped forward, holding a sheet of paper, her face tense with concentration. "The name is Valerio Alvarez. He's based out of Panama. We've got a few key links between him and Blackwell, financial transactions, arms deals, and some covert operations. It seems like Alvarez is the one running the show now. Blackwell was just the middleman." John took the paper, scanning the information quickly. Alvarez. The name rang no bells, but John had learned that in this game, knowing the name wasn't always enough. The real question was how deep this man's influence ran, and more importantly, how to take him down. Clara, standing beside him, spoke up, her voice tight. "Valerio Alvarez isn't just some businessman or drug lord. He's connected. High up. He has political ties, control over military factions, and access to private security firms. If Blackwell was his pawn, then we're dealing with something much bigger than we imagined." John's jaw tightened. This wasn't just another drug kingpin. Alvarez was dangerous. He was a puppet master, pulling strings at the highest levels, with the resources to wage war on anyone who stood in his way. "What's the plan?" John asked, his voice grim. Graves, who had been watching from across the room, now moved toward them. He exchanged a glance with Clara before addressing John. "We go after Alvarez, but we need to be smart about it. He's too well protected, too well hidden. He'll have eyes everywhere. We can't just show up on his doorstep and expect to take him down. We need leverage, something he cares about." John thought for a moment. "You said there were political ties. That could be our entry point. If we can expose him to the right people, make him vulnerable." Graves nodded. "Exactly. We need to find something, some weakness, that will make Alvarez slip up. It could be a connection, a secret. He's too calculated to go down any other way. We'll use the networks we have access to. Make sure we're feeding the right information to the right people. It's a game of shadows, but we're going to make sure we're the ones holding the strings this time." Clara's eyes narrowed. "You'll need to be careful. The people you're about to cross are dangerous. They'll try to get to you before you get to them. And if Alvarez doesn't get you, someone else will." John nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. The more he learned, the clearer it became. There was no easy way out of this. Alvarez would come after him. His enemies were everywhere, and the path ahead was filled with unknown dangers. But it wasn't just about stopping Alvarez anymore. John had started this fight to survive. Now, it was about something much larger, taking down the entire network. "So, what's the first step?" John asked, his mind already shifting into mission mode. His pulse had quickened, adrenaline surging through his veins. This was what he was built for. Graves met his gaze, his expression hardening. "First, we gather intel. We dig deeper into Alvarez's operations. We need to know everything, who he's working with, who his allies are, and how to exploit his vulnerabilities. We'll use the tools at our disposal. The rest will come after that. Clara stepped forward, giving John a cold but almost reassuring look. Get ready. This is just the beginning. John clenched his fists. His mind was already planning the next steps, his thoughts moving faster than his heart could keep up. Alvarez was the key. He was the thread that tied everything together. And cutting that thread was the only way to take down the entire network. But as he stood there, in the quiet of this hidden operations center, John couldn't shake the feeling that the true battle was yet to come. The enemy wasn't just out there. It was already inside. John paced the dimly lit room, his boots clicking softly against the concrete floor. The operation was moving at a rapid pace, but the pieces were still scattered, incomplete. The more he thought about Alvarez, the deeper the pit in his stomach grew. This man wasn't just a cartel kingpin or a corrupt politician. He was a puppet master, and those who held the strings behind him, whoever they were the real threat. The team had spent hours working through the data, tracing every lead they could find. The financial transactions, the encrypted communications, each bit of intelligence revealed another layer of the network. But Alvarez remained elusive, like a shadow slipping through their fingers. Graves had sent some of his operatives to dig deeper into Alvarez's operations, but the man was far too careful. Every trail led to a dead end or another layer of obfuscation. John could feel the pressure mounting, the walls closing in. The clock was ticking, and every minute spent here made it more likely that Alvarez would slip away, or worse, retaliate. Clara stood by the door, watching him with a detached calm. She had been quieter than usual since they'd gotten back to the compound, but John couldn't shake the feeling that there was more she wasn't telling him. Her connections were deeper than she'd let on, and that made her just as dangerous as the people they were hunting. After a long pause, Clara spoke, her voice low but cutting through the silence. You're thinking too hard, John. Trying to anticipate every move is going to drive you crazy. John stopped pacing and looked at her, his brow furrowing. I'm thinking about how to stay alive. This isn't just some cartel operation. Alvarez is only one part of something much bigger. If we don't move soon, we'll be caught in the crossfire, and I'm not ready to be someone's pawn. Clara's eyes softened for a moment, but the edge in her voice never dulled. You're not wrong, but you're not alone in this anymore. Graves and the others are in this with you, whether you like it or not. John's jaw tightened. I didn't sign up for this, Clara. I didn't sign up for any of this. No one ever does, she replied, her eyes unreadable. But sometimes, the world doesn't give you a choice. You can either sit back and wait to be destroyed, or you can fight. And right now, you're fighting for more than your life. You're fighting for control. John's mind raced. Control. That was the key, wasn't it? The one thing Alvarez wanted. The one thing that had tied all of this together. Power. The ability to control not just territory or resources, but the very systems that ran the world. Alvarez had built something far bigger than any cartel, and in doing so, he'd made an enemy of every government, every corporation, and every individual who valued freedom. John had been trying to piece it all together. How to get close enough to Alvarez to destroy him. But what if the real answer was bigger than just taking him out? What if stopping Alvarez meant bringing down the entire network? Clara's words lingered in his mind. You're fighting for control. A thought clicked into place. We need to expose Alvarez. We need to make him so vulnerable that everyone, every ally, every power player, turns on him. We have to disrupt the network from the inside. Clara didn't say anything for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was laced with a quiet recognition. You're not wrong, but it won't be easy. Alvarez has too many connections. He'll see it coming, and he won't hesitate to burn everyone around him to protect himself. John's gaze hardened. Then we give him something to burn. We give him something that'll force his hand. Graves entered the room, his expression grim as he looked at the two of them. What's the plan? John turned toward him, the idea solidifying in his mind. We start by feeding misinformation to Alvarez's network. Create confusion. Make them question everything. We plant a story. Make him believe there's a mole in his inner circle. If we do it right, he'll go into survival mode. And when that happens, the entire system will start to collapse. Graves studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. It's dangerous, but it could work. If we get it right. John didn't need to hear any more. His mind was already moving, strategizing. He could see it now, the cracks in the foundation, the moment when everything would start to unravel. It would be messy, chaotic, but it was the only way to take Alvarez down. The question was, how would they get the right people to believe it? Who could they trust? Clara, sensing his hesitation, stepped forward. We have people on the inside. There are operatives who have infiltrated his network, people who can make sure the story sticks. We can control the narrative. But it'll take all of us working together. John nodded. The pieces were finally coming together. Graves slapped a file down on the table. This is what we've got on Alvarez. Everything from his financials to his personal contacts. We're feeding this info to the right people, underground channels, governments, and corporate powers. We'll make them believe there's a rat in the system. Once they start turning on each other, we move in. John looked at the file, his mind running through every possible scenario. Timing was everything. They had to act fast, before Alvarez realized what was happening. One slip-up, and the entire plan could fall apart. Clara looked at John, her expression unreadable. We do this, and we put ourselves in the crosshairs. There's no going back after this. John met her gaze, his voice unwavering. There's no going back anyway. Let's finish this. The operation had begun. The clock was ticking, and every second counted. John could feel the weight of what they were about to do. The risk, the stakes, the inevitability of chaos. But there was no turning back. This was the only way to bring Alvarez down, to take out the entire network that had been operating in the shadows for so long. John sat in front of a computer screen, his fingers flying across the keys as he worked with the team to feed misinformation into the channels that Alvarez trusted. It was a game of precision. One wrong move and the entire operation would crumble. But if they succeeded, Alvarez would implode from within, his own people turning on him in a frenzy of paranoia. Clara and Graves had moved to another part of the building, coordinating the ground-level operations. They had their own set of contacts, people deep inside Alvarez's network, who would push the narrative they'd created. They had planted the seed, a rat in the ranks, a double agent feeding information to a rival faction. It wasn't just a story, it was a trap, and Alvarez would have no choice but to believe it. As the hours dragged on, John's mind raced. What if Alvarez didn't take the bait? What if he was smarter than they anticipated, able to see through the ruse before it was too late? But that was a risk they had to take. The deeper they dug, the more they uncovered about Alvarez's operations, and the more they realized how deeply entrenched he was in every facet of the global power structure. This wasn't just a cartel. This was an empire. John knew he wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for something far bigger, a chance to tear down the walls of this empire. The sound of footsteps broke his concentration. Clara entered the room, her expression grim. "It's working," she said quietly. "The story's spreading. People are already starting to ask questions. But it won't take long for Alvarez to react." John stood up, his gaze steady. "Let's make sure he doesn't have time to react. We need to move fast." They were playing with fire, but John couldn't help feeling a sense of exhilaration. For the first time since all of this started, he had the upper hand. The network was about to fracture. Alvarez was about to become the hunted. Clara handed him a folder. More intelligence, more names, more connections. John flipped through it quickly, scanning the information. It was a list of key players in Alvarez's operation, each one connected to him by invisible threads. Some were high-level cartel members, others were politicians, business moguls, even military officials. It was a web of power so vast that John could hardly fathom it. "Who's our target?" John asked, his voice sharp with focus. Clara's finger pointed to one name on the list. Andres Salazar. He's one of Alvarez's most trusted men, runs his operations in South America. If we take him out, we hit Alvarez at his core. It'll cause a ripple effect through his entire organization. John studied the name for a moment. Salazar was a major player, but he wasn't the final piece of the puzzle. Alvarez had others. Still, taking him out would be a major blow. "What's the plan?" John asked, already thinking ahead. We infiltrate his inner circle, Clara replied. We feed him more false intel, make him believe that Alvarez is about to betray him. We make him paranoid, and we use that to our advantage. If we get him to turn, we can hit Alvarez where it hurts. It was a dangerous gamble, but it was the best chance they had. And John had learned to take risks. They moved quickly, assembling a small team of operatives who had been trained in covert infiltration. John would work alongside them, blending in with Salazar's forces, earning their trust. But it would take time they didn't have. Alvarez was already starting to feel the pressure, and the sooner they struck, the better. Graves joined them in the operations room. "We've got a window," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Salazar's on the move. He'll be attending a private meeting in Bogota in 3 days. That's when we make our move." John nodded. "Let's do it." 3 days wasn't much time, but John had lived his life in high-stakes situations, and he was ready. They had one shot at this. One shot to dismantle the entire operation. The team spent the next few days preparing, gathering equipment, and ensuring every detail of the plan was in place. John and Clara would go in deep, using their contacts to get close to Salazar and his operation. The rest of the team would remain on standby, ready to act if things went wrong. When the day finally arrived, they were ready. The flight to Bogota was tense, filled with the quiet hum of anticipation. John sat in the back of the plane, his mind focused. He had always been good at blocking out distractions, but this mission felt different. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about making a real change. When they arrived, the air was thick with humidity, and the city seemed to pulse with a dangerous energy. Clara led the way as they navigated through the streets, blending in with the locals. John kept his eyes peeled, his instincts on high alert. They arrived at their safe house, a small, inconspicuous apartment on the outskirts of the city. The rest of the team would be waiting in the shadows, watching and listening, ready to provide support if needed. John and Clara spent the next several hours preparing for the meeting. Clara had managed to secure a position within Salazar's operation, a trusted intermediary who would be able to introduce them into his inner circle. It was their only shot at getting close to Salazar without raising suspicion. As night fell, the time to move had come. They entered the venue where Salazar's meeting would take place, an upscale, private venue with tight security. Clara's contact had arranged for them to slip through undetected, but John could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on him. One wrong move, and everything would fall apart. They moved through the venue, keeping to the shadows, blending into the crowd of well-dressed men and women. John's heart pounded in his chest as they approached the meeting room. They had no idea what would happen next. The plan could go south at any moment. But when they reached the door, Clara held up a hand to stop him. "We wait," she whispered, her voice steady. "We wait for the signal." John nodded, his breath shallow. This was it. The waiting room was eerily silent, save for the distant sounds of murmurs from the gathering outside. John's mind raced as he stood beside Clara, his back pressed against the cool, marble wall. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. They were on the brink of something massive, something that could tear apart everything Alvarez had built. But one slip, one mistake, and they could lose everything. Clara's sharp eyes scanned the room, her movements quiet, precise. She was a seasoned operator, always calm under pressure. But even she couldn't mask the tension in the air. They both knew that once they walked through that door, there was no going back. This wasn't just a mission. It was the final act in a long, bloody fight for control, for survival. "Ready?" Clara whispered, her voice calm but full of intent. John didn't respond immediately. Instead, he ran through the plan in his mind again, making sure every detail was accounted for. They had prepared for every possible outcome, but the truth was, no one could predict how Salazar would react. Paranoia was already running wild in Alvarez's network. Trust had become a rare commodity, and fear was the glue that kept everything together. The slightest spark could ignite the entire structure. John's hand brushed against the cool metal of the door handle. He looked over at Clara one last time. She met his gaze with a small nod, her eyes fierce. "Stay focused," she said, her voice unwavering. With a deep breath, John turned the handle, stepping into the dimly lit room beyond. The atmosphere immediately felt different, opulent, but charged with an air of danger. The room was set up for high-level discussions, with a large oval table at the center surrounded by men in suits. Salazar was already seated at the head, his back to the door, flanked by two heavily armed guards. John and Clara moved swiftly and silently, blending into the shadows at the edges of the room. They were just two more bodies in the mix. Salazar didn't notice them right away, too caught up in his conversation with his lieutenants, who spoke in low, urgent tones. For a long moment, John watched, gauging the room, listening for anything that could give him an edge. The murmurs continued as Salazar addressed a key figure, a man who appeared to be one of his closest advisors. Their conversation was hushed but intense. The time to make their move was coming. The team back at the safe house was waiting for the signal, poised to take action when the moment was right. Clara subtly gestured to John, signaling him to approach. They needed to act fast. Salazar wouldn't stay distracted for long. John moved to the front of the room, keeping his steps slow and deliberate. As he reached the table, he caught Salazar's eye. The cartel leader's gaze sharpened, suspicion flickering in his eyes as he looked John over. "You're early," Salazar said, his tone clipped, but not immediately hostile. John gave a slight nod, his voice neutral. "I have information that can help you. You need to hear this." Salazar leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Information? About what?" "The loyalty of your people," John replied smoothly, keeping his voice steady. "There's someone inside your ranks working against you, feeding intel to Alvarez's rivals. You've got a mole." The words hung in the air for a moment, heavy with the weight of their implication. For a brief second, Salazar didn't react, but his eyes flicked toward one of his guards, then back to John, his expression hardening. "Who are you?" Salazar asked, his voice now laced with suspicion. "I'm someone who can help you take control back," John said, keeping his gaze steady. "But you need to trust me. I can get you the evidence you need to take out the mole and expose Alvarez for what he is." Salazar remained silent for a beat, considering the offer. His eyes narrowed, but there was no immediate sign of aggression. He was calculating, weighing the risk. "You come to me with an offer, but I don't know who the hell you are. Why should I trust you?" Salazar's voice was low, almost a growl. John was ready for this. He knew this was the critical moment, where every word had to count. "Because Alvarez is playing you. He's using you as a pawn, just like everyone else. You're too valuable to be left in the dark." The tension in the room was palpable, every second dragging by as Salazar deliberated. Then, finally, his expression shifted. He raised his hand, signaling for the guards to stand down. "All right," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "Prove it." John gave a small nod, signaling Clara to move. She stepped forward, sliding a small USB drive onto the table. Salazar's eyes flicked toward it, his fingers hovering over the device, but his hesitation was clear. "What's this?" he asked, distrust still evident. "Evidence," John replied. "A full report of everything Alvarez has been planning behind your back. You'll see for yourself, but you'll need to make a choice. You expose him now, and you take control. Or you stay loyal to him, and you keep playing the fool." Salazar looked at the USB drive, then back at John, his eyes hard. The moment felt like it was suspended in time. John knew that once Salazar made his move, everything would change. They would either expose Alvarez and bring down the entire network, or the network would close ranks and the operation would implode. Salazar's hand reached for the drive. He inserted it into a laptop, his eyes scanning the files that appeared on the screen. As the documents loaded, John could feel the tension rise, the stakes growing higher with each passing second. Salazar's face went pale as the evidence became clear. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, flicking through the data with increasing speed. He cursed under his breath as the realization sank in. Alvarez had been playing him. He was expendable.